Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday edition. Here's my plan, and y'all can tell me what you think your plan ought to be. I want to finish with this panel. I know we have Rose Jackson here for one issue. We have Mr. Rooks available to talk about that one pre-filed exhibit, and I think there's some questions for him. So I want to go those in order and then get to Mr. Brown and Ms. Walker. And then we're gonna complete all of those today. So I think we're at cross for these gentlemen. So I think it's ORS turn.
Again, good morning, Chairman, Commissioners, Mr. Butler, Jim Cox from the White Law Firm in Greenville, appearing on behalf of the ORS. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Mr. Young, I'd like to start with you. Is it true that you've retained your own personal lawyer in connections with the proceedings here today?
Yes.
And that attorney is present here with you today, is that correct?
Yes.
Is it correct that SC is paying your legal expenses for your personal attorney?
Yes.
Mr. Young, you testified in your pre-filed testimony that you became the manager of nuclear construction in 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, the title was Manager Nuclear Plant Construction.
And who preceded you in that role?
That role was preceded by my boss at the time, Alan Torres.
And where did he move after you assumed his position?
Well, he had been the general manager of nuclear plant construction for a few years on the project.
And so was that a new role that you filled when you assumed that title in 2015?
Well, it was a role that he had previously occupied. He had been promoted a number of years before to a general manager level position as the project grew in pace and scope and number of employees. And then that position, from my understanding, was targeted to start the project management organization as one of the activities that started in 2015.
So no one left the company when you assumed that role of manager of, you called it plant construction, is that right?
Manager nuclear plant construction.
So is it correct to say that no one left the company when you assumed that role?
Correct.
Now, you testified that you were, I think, a liaison, you described it, to the SC team in 2014 that reviewed the consortium's cost estimate. Is that correct?
Correct. That team was mostly made up, the 2014 EAC team, if that's the one you're referring to, was mostly comprised of business and financial personnel. And I guess liaison is just an informal title I had to liaison between other departments and groups in the NND organization, such as construction, the department I was in.
Was your role as liaison to provide expertise with respect to construction issues as it relates to cost estimates?
My understanding of my role was to primarily inform the cost side of the EAC team of the schedule review that had been done because we received the schedule many weeks prior to receiving the cost information from the consortium. So those were two separate teams, as I mentioned in my testimony.
Well, the cost team received that schedule from Westinghouse, correct?
The schedule was a number of proposals of options for an eventual completion date for the plant, and that was presented in early August. And then the cost information was not delivered to the owners, SC&G and Santee Cooper, until the end of August.
Can you give an example of what type of information you provided that cost team with respect to your role as liaison to that team?
So some of the information that I would have provided would have been the schedule evaluation that was done, the overall commercial operation dates. I think the cost team needed to determine a cash flow for the remainder of the project. That's a requirement of a submittal that would go to the Public Service Commission or something that's needed to manage the project as well. And so they would want to know what the ultimate end date was going to be. And since the consortium had not presented a single date, they presented a number of options. There was a lot of information that had to be conveyed to the cost team on the status of that review.
And I think you testified that ultimately, from the construction side, SC&G accepted the June 2019-2020 substantial completion dates from the consortium. Is that correct?
It was accepted that was the best information that was available at the time, the most reliable information. But along with that, there was no commercial change. Negotiations were still ongoing with any kind of EPC amendment.
And the cost team, the internal SCE&G cost team, that team included Mr. Kokums, Ken Brown, Margaret Felkel, and Ms. Wicker. Is that correct?
Yes, it was Sherry Wicker.
Sherry Wicker. And that team was authorized by SC&G to perform the work it did. Is that correct?
I think that team was constituted as part of the normal oversight process. This was somewhat of a unique or special occasion since there was a rebaselining of the cost and schedule going on. So there was just often as there were, when there were special or different circumstances, a team was constituted to review the information or provide the best oversight.
You weren't involved in the actual cost estimates that team developed. Is that correct?
I was involved in reviewing the estimate received from the consortium to focus on understanding the assumptions they made. So, for example, there were assumptions made on resources available. There were assumptions made on changes that had come down from engineering versus the original scope that increased the number of items that had to go in the plant. So that was mostly my position, was helping the financial team understand those changes and gathering the information for those that surrounded those changes.
And is it correct that ultimately that internal SCE&G cost team in 2014 determined that the estimate to complete the project cost would be about $500 million greater than the consortium had projected?
Well, I don't think that was my understanding. I think that I would break the team's purpose down into two primary purposes. One was to understand the consortium's assumptions and their EAC, since it was a rebaseline. And then the second, I would say that was really the more primary goal. The second was to determine entitlement. So since there were ongoing negotiations that were expected to conclude at that time at the end of 2014, our senior management really wanted to know what we thought as a team in an oversight role, what the consortium was entitled to. Were they entitled because of some provision in the contract, such as a regulatory change, to an increase in the baseline cost of the plant? That was the main purpose, was to determine entitlement and to make recommendations for entitlement to the senior management team. So
just to summarize, you're saying there's really two purposes to that EAC team. One is determine what SC&G is going to pay the consortium, i.e. what the consortium is entitled to receive under the EPC contract. And the second purpose is to see what is it going to actually cost to complete construction. Is that fair to say?
No, that's not fair to say.
Okay, tell me how I got that wrong.
Okay, so you got the first part right about entitlement, that we were trying to determine entitlement. The second part was to try to determine what assumptions that the consortium had made. and try to understand those assumptions. That was part of the rebaselining effort.
And so it's your testimony that the consortium, or I'm sorry, the EAC team never estimated what the actual cost to complete the project would be?
No, I mean, the EAC team estimated the actual owner's cost at that time because the owner's cost was driven by changes in the EPC cost, such as the schedule changing and the cash flow changing and the owner's cost changing. That was my understanding. But no, the EAC team's primary purpose was not to come up with a separate EAC. It was to determine recommended entitlement to the senior management team.
I understand what you're saying about the primary purpose. My question, though, is what the team actually did. Did the EAC team actually come up with a cost estimate as far as how much it would cost to complete construction of the project?
No, not an independent, full, built-up estimate or anything like that. The EAC team, on a couple of points on the cost side, did what I would term as sensitivity studies. So the consortium would make some assumptions. The consortium also made some commitments during their initial presentation of the EAC costs. And the EAC team did what I would term as sensitivity studies. If this factor changed or this assumption changed, would that lower or raise the cost, and by how much? And I saw that as really good information that our senior management would need to know in case there was some negotiating point that they had to make.
And this sensitivity analysis included estimates of what the most likely labor productivity factor would be. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were really three main factors I remember that were looked at. There was a tool that Mr. Brown, who was on the team, had helped create with Mr. Cherry of Santee Cooper. I believe it was even before we received the information. And that tool had really three variables that you could change that would tell sensitivity to cost. It had performance factor. It had the variable of direct craft to indirect craft, craft that are actually installing items in the plant versus craft that are supporting those people installing. And then the third was what we termed field non-manual, so a field engineer or a quality control person, their ratio to the direct craft. Those were three ratios that the consortium had presented in their original estimates in 2008 and 9, and those were ratios that had changed in the course of time of the project, and those were ratios they were making assumptions around in this rebaselining of the EAC.
And it's correct that the SC&G internal EAC team concluded that the PF factor used in the consortium's EAC analysis was not achievable. Isn't that right?
I don't think that the team determined that the PF the consortium used was not achievable over the course of time of the project. No, I don't agree with that.
And have you seen that? Did you see the EAC team's final report on that issue?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to put up on the slide here Mr. Young, this is the front page of a PowerPoint slide presentation created by the SC&G EAC team. Are you familiar with this presentation?
I believe so. I think the format I've seen it in is as an exhibit to Mr. Gary Jones's testimony. I don't know if this is the same document, but it looks similar.
And is it correct that the EAC...
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just inquiring as to whether or not, Mr. Cox, you have a copy of the exhibit you can hand to the witness.
I believe I do.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Young, have you seen this presentation before?
Yes, I believe so. I think there are two similar versions of this. One is closer to the date of the actual executive meeting that's on the title. I think this was just a draft by the team in preparation for that meeting.
And is it correct that the EAC team presented its findings to senior management of SC&G in October 2014?
Those were initial findings of the work that had been done to date. I wouldn't term those as a final presentation.
And did those
That's the way you termed it.
Okay. When was the final presentation made?
I don't recall a final presentation. I do recall what was pretty close to a final report, though I think it noted there was a couple of items that had not been totally completed in the review.
And at this presentation, is it correct that SC&G, the EAC team, informed senior management that it did not believe that the consortium could meet the PF factor of 1.15 that the consortium was using in its cost estimate?
I think the EAC team delivered the cost that could occur around that PF change. That was the main message, was if PF is higher than what the consortium committed to, then PF would result in higher costs in the target category for the project. And that would be something that I would have wanted the executives to know so that they could arm themselves going into a negotiation so they could get some better structure in the contract around payments in that category and get a better incentive for the contractor to perform.
But isn't it true that the EAC team also said, we don't think the consortium can meet the PF factor of 1.15 that it's projecting in its cost estimate?
I don't think the EAC team ever made that conclusion. I think the EAC team discussed the current performance that was ongoing as the time had passed during our review, and we were getting some new data points from the consortium on their real near-term performance. And I think we looked at the mitigations, but again, the EAC team was not focused on the mitigations available. It was focused on understanding the costs that had been presented by the consortium and all the assumptions that had gone into that.
I'd like for you to turn. This is the third page of the presentation, Mr. Young. Was this slide presented to senior management at the October 2014 meeting?
I don't know. I don't recall being at that meeting.
Oh, so you weren't present there?
I can't remember if I was present at that particular meeting. Like I said, I was going back and forth between the schedule review of the EAC and the cost review, and then also working on the current job I had at the time of supervising the nuclear island area of the plant.
So is it fair to say, Mr. Young, that the other individuals mentioned on the first page of this slide, Mr. Brown, Ms. Felkel, Mr. Kokums, and Ms. Wicker, were more involved in the EAC cost analysis done by SC&G than you were?
That's fair to state. As I said, I was more involved in the schedule review than the cost review.
Is it correct to say that using a longer schedule in a cost analysis will result in higher costs to complete construction?
Not always.
Why not always? Can you explain that?
For example, if you have a shorter schedule that requires payment of things like overtime or night shift, where you might find more like a second shift where you might have more inefficiencies or might have to pay a premium to get people to work that night shift. Those kind of mitigation strategies to create a shorter schedule could definitely result in a higher cost.
So in other words, if you're increasing the amount of labor in a shorter time, that could raise the cost. Is that what you're saying?
It could.
Now, let's assume two schedules with the exact same productivity factor as far as the efficiency of labor. Is there an independent analysis in the cost estimate where a longer schedule will, by itself, add to cost?
Well, the area where a longer schedule would add to cost is an area where you would lengthen, I guess sometimes we termed it as hotel load, the amount of people or staff or programs that had to be kept in place to run the project over a longer course of time. But the biggest factor is, on this project, and I think that's relevant to your question, was the labor. Yep. Okay. The labor of the direct craft and the labor of the folks out in the field.
So let me refine the question a bit. Assuming all else stays the same, in the analysis, will a longer schedule result in a higher cost to the project?
It just depends on so many factors and assumptions. That's just too simple of an analysis to say yes or no to.
So you can't say, even if I assume all of those other factors are the same, productivity, direct to indirect, craft non-manual, I assume all those are the same, but I just project a longer schedule to complete construction. You can't say that would necessarily increase cost.
Not necessarily, no.
Now, Mr. Young, your testimony, it didn't mention the word Bechtel at all in it. Am I correct in concluding that?
I don't recall that being in my testimony.
That seemed a little strange since Bechtel's assessment is central to this case. Why didn't you mention it in your testimony?
I think I was trying to get the pertinent facts relayed in my testimony about the things I talked about the decision to abandon, the major changes that had taken course in the project, and it did not come up as necessary to put in. But I'm definitely can answer questions in that area if you need to ask them. I'm happy to inform the commission on that subject. I know it's been a major topic in this hearing.
Were you informed of the results of Bechtel's assessment in 2015 or 16?
I was given a briefing on Bechtel's assessment after their, I think the way it was termed to me, their exit meeting on October 22nd. And that was in 2015.
Who gave you that briefing?
I believe it was, I can't recall the exact person, but I believe it was Jeff Archie or Ron Jones or Steve Byrne.
And what did they tell you?
They told me that essentially there were no new issues that had been brought up, that Bechtel had done a pretty good job of writing down the current issues on site and documenting those, and that there were really no new or information that was relayed on the project. They also mentioned that Bechtel had kind of ended the meeting with leaving the door open for more work to be done on the project.
Did they tell you anything about Bechtel's assessment of the schedule?
No.
Did they tell you that Bechtel had assessed an approximate 2-year delay to the substantial completion date?
I don't recall that.
You were here when Gary Jones testified about his conversation with you about the results of the Bechtel assessment, correct?
Yes, I was here that day when he testified, yes.
And did you hear him describe that the conversation that he had with you about the results of the Bechtel assessment?
Yes, I heard him describe the conversation he had with me, that he recalled the conversation with Mr. Torres and Mr. Smith.
And was his description of the conversation that he had with you about the Bechtel assessment, was his description of that conversation accurate?
I think it's generally accurate. I relayed to Mr. Jones what I had been told. I just don't recall the exact date, but it seems like that was most likely around the October 27th time frame. I think that was the dates of their monthly meeting that month, the 2 days they were on site. So I had just been told a few days before the briefing I described to you, and that was the exact information I relayed to Mr. Jones.
Sitting here today, Mr. Young, does it disturb you that you didn't know about Bechtel's assessment of the schedule?
No, I mean, I don't really know that what I would have done with that assessment at the time. So my understanding is that those two dates were presented on October 22nd in a presentation, and there was a little bit of background given to those dates. The next day, October 23rd, I believe that was a Friday, I went up to Fluor's office, and I was told under a confidentiality agreement that Fluor would be joining the project as a subcontractor. Westinghouse would be exiting. Westinghouse would be taking over the project with Fluor as their subcontractor, and CB&I would be exiting. So my focus was really on that, and my focus was on the effort that Westinghouse and Fluor would put into rebaselining the schedule. And then I think that confidentiality agreement expired just a few days later when the announcement went public. I think it was October 27th. And I believe that was about the same time frame that the ORS was informed Mr. Jones was on site for his monthly visit, about the same time that announcement came out. And then once that announcement came out, I was assigned to lead a team that was going to work with Fluor and Westinghouse and some of their other Westinghouse consultants on rebaselining the project schedule and rebaselining under the new terms of the contract. So my understanding now of Bechtel's assessment, that it was really based on the old contract terms. It wasn't based on a lot of the new assumptions. Or they really didn't know the new assumptions that Westinghouse and Fluor would make. And then I participated in that assessment with Fluor offsite for about 2 months before they were allowed to come on site. And then after that, we were off and running with a lot of the lists of improvements that were on the site in 2016 timeframe.
And is it correct to say that SC&G tracked the recommendations made by Bechtel as part of its improvement effort?
I think SC&G tracked a lot of improvement recommendations. The number one thing we were tracking were improvements that were proposed by Westinghouse and Fluor in the 2016 timeframe. Those were described as functional area assessments, or FAAs. And I do recall that I was asked to provide input to the list of recommendations that came out of the Bechtel report. I was asked by an attorney in our company to do that. And I really don't recall exactly what happened to that list after that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could approach the witness and show him a document that's been produced. Mr. Young, I've handed you a spreadsheet that's been produced by SC&G in this litigation. It's a 5-page document entitled Comparison of SCE&G Recommendations to Bechtel Recommendations. Have you seen this document before?
I just can't recall if I've seen it or not.
Okay. Is it correct to say, though, that you recall tracking recommendations made by Bechtel following the Bechtel assessment in 2015?
I don't recall tracking them. What I recall is that I gave information. I was asked to look at the recommendations and look at the observations from just the project assessment report and provide any input. And basically I kind of did a mental bucketing and then eventually provided some feedback and said, these recommendations are either applicable to the contractor, to the consortium, or they're applicable to the owner. That was the first step. The next step was these are mooted by the EPC amendment that happened in October of 2015. And then the next step were these are addressed by Westinghouse and Fluor in their transition planning. And then the third step were these actively being looked at under that FAA program I described to you that Fluor and Westinghouse were pursuing.
So it's correct to say that SC&G was looking at the Bechtel recommendations and determining how each of those was resolved, or how it would resolve each of those?
I think that's fairly characterized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request that this spreadsheet be entered as the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Chairman, there's been absolutely no foundation as to this particular document. Mr. Young isn't familiar with it, doesn't have a Bates label, and until there has been some foundation laid for its accuracy and authenticity through a witness, it shouldn't be admitted into the record.
If I may respond, Mr. Chairman, this was a document produced by SC&G in this format, what's called the native Excel format. ORS has submitted a voluminous number of exhibits that were produced by SC&G, and they're admissible because they are authenticated by SC&G itself and can be admitted for the value that they present in their own right, regardless of Mr. Young's knowledge of the document.
The only thing I would add to that, Mr. Chairman, is that they are not authenticated, self-authenticating in some way. The document has to be introduced through a witness who has familiarity with it and can testify as to it.
Sustained. We're going to sustain that objection.
Mr. Young, Bechtel interviewed you during the assessment, didn't they?
No.
They did not?
I do not recall being interviewed by Bechtel during their assessment.
Did you ever meet with any Bechtel representatives during the assessment?
I recall one meeting that I was invited to by Ron Jones with Dick Miller, who was leading the assessment.
Okay, and what happened in that meeting?
Mr. Miller, it appeared to be given an update on information he had or hadn't received and some preliminary observations that his team had.
So let's talk about the schedule that you received from the consortium during the course of the project. My first question, Mr. Young, is under the EPC contract, who was responsible for providing SC&G a schedule?
The consortium.
And after the October 2015 amendment, who became responsible for providing a schedule to SC&G at that point in time?
That did not change.
There was no consortium after then, right?
No, there was a consortium of Westinghouse and Stone & Webster throughout the course of the project. It was just that Stone & Webster was owned by 3 different companies during the course of the project. Shaw, then Chicago Bridge and Iron, then Westinghouse or one of their subsidiaries owned Stone & Webster.
So Stone & Webster was providing the schedule to SC&G throughout the life of the project?
No, the consortium of those 2 companies together provided the schedule.
So after the amendment, Westinghouse and Stone, which owned Stone & Webster, was providing the schedule to SC&G, correct?
Correct.
And Fluor was not responsible for providing a schedule to SC&G, is that correct?
Fluor was responsible. No, they were providing input to the schedule as a subcontractor under Westinghouse. Once they were on site in January, and they were providing planning information to Westinghouse prior to that time.
And Fluor never provided SC&G directly with a schedule, is that correct?
I don't recall Fluor providing SC&G directly with a schedule, no.
And is it correct that the individual from the consortium who was providing SC&G with the schedule, the lead individual was a gentleman named Terry Elam?
Terry Elam, my tenure on the site and the project, Terry Elam was the lead scheduler. I think his title may have changed slightly during time with those different companies, but he was the lead scheduler or director for the consortium.
And is it correct that the consortium never provided SC&G with a schedule that was resource loaded?
No, that's incorrect. The consortium provided SC&G with schedules, and we had knowledge of schedules that were resource loaded in certain areas of the schedule.
So if Mr. Elam testified that the schedule provided by the consortium was not resource loaded, you would disagree with that?
I think I would agree that it was never fully resource loaded, that all activities in the schedule were resource loaded, but portions of the schedule were resource loaded, especially toward the end of the project, as that became more necessary as we were moving toward bulk construction. And then the way that Shaw and CB&I continued this practice, the way they did resource loading was to maintain the resources in a separate database called ShawTrack, and then CB9 changed the name to Progress Tracker. So there was a Primavera P6 database program where all the scheduling information was housed on a server, I think typically up in Westinghouse's home office. And then the resource information was maintained in the CB9 project control system for the construction work.
Mr. Young, is it correct that the consortium didn't give you access, you or SC&G access to a project schedule from February 2014 through August 1st, 2014?
They did not deliver the monthly schedule revision from that time, but they delivered near-term and interim schedules. So multiple week look-aheads. Those were delivered, and those were delivered usually on a weekly basis anyways. And they also delivered through the monthly meeting and some other deliverables, an interim schedule 12 to 18 months out in the future.
But they weren't providing the full schedule required under the EPC contract, is that correct?
They wrote in a letter that they were rebaselining the schedule and had communicated that they were going to give that to us, communicate that to us in the third quarter of 2014.
And their failure to give you a schedule, give SC&G a schedule, was hurting the company's operational readiness, correct?
It was hurting that company's operational readiness.
Yes.
Well, I think there was a desire by SCENG to go ahead and ramp up our scheduling organization that was going to support the operational readiness. And that scheduling organization depended on linking their schedule in the SCENG database in Primavera to the consortium schedule. That was something that was going to have to occur toward the end of the project so that they could monitor their readiness through milestones that were tied to construction and startup activities. So yes, they weren't able to just electronically link that. They had to manually control that and estimate when those dates would be.
It was correct that ORS was asking during this time period about whether the consortium's failure to give SC&G a schedule was violating the EPC contract.
Yeah, I'm aware that discussion occurred. I'm also aware that I think at times it's been characterized as the project doesn't have a schedule. So I think those two things were definitely issues. And so I think our team was trying to communicate with ORS. We have an intermediate and a near-term schedule. So there is a schedule to construct, engineer, procure, and construct the plant by. But the consortium had not submitted a full rebaseline schedule yet.
You remember that there was some dispute within SC&G as to whether ORS has been provided accurate information about whether the consortium was in compliance with the contract, correct?
I wouldn't determine that. I wouldn't characterize that as a dispute. I think there were a couple of opinions on whether the contract was being fully complied to, whether the consortium needed to be put on notice in a certain aspect of the contract. But that was something that the commercial team who was supervising the contract was always having to deal with throughout the course of the project. Were the consortium meeting the contract expectations, and did they need to be put on notice if there was a gray area where they weren't?
And I'd like to go ahead and look at an email I'm referring to. I'll provide you with a copy, if I may, Mr. Chair. So this is a 3-page email. I'd like to turn your attention, Mr. Young, once you've had a chance to review it, to the first page. There's an email from Shirley Johnson to Abney Skip Smith, and it's entitled regarding IPS schedule review. And in that email, Ms. Johnson states, quote, "In my mind, since they have not given us access to a schedule since February 2014, the consortium has not been complying with Article 3.3. And now that there is a schedule, but they are not giving us access to an electronic version, they will not be in compliance with change order number 10, end quote. Do you see where that is in the email, Mr. Young?
Yes.
And Article 3.3, Ms. Johnson's referring to the EPC contract, correct?
Yes, I believe mentions a paragraph about scheduled deliverables in the EPC contract.
And moving along, Mr. Smith forwards that email to you. Is that correct?
Correct. I think Mr. Smith was aware that I was going to be leading the schedule review because we were expecting to receive that information any day from the consortium.
And you responded to Mr. Smith and copied Ms. Johnson and said, quote, just be mindful that if you use the Article 3.3 stance that they have not given us access to a schedule since February, this may contradict what Allen told the ORS, Dukes, in response to their question whether the consortium is out of compliance. From my understanding, Allen cited the 3-week look-ahead and the 18-month look-ahead schedules as compliance with delivering a schedule, end quote, on the first paragraph. Second paragraph, quote, separately, I think the CO 10 argument would be cleaner. It will also hurt our operational readiness efforts because we need an electronic IPS to help tie the SCE&G OR schedule to consortium end dates for testing and system turnover to our pre-op and maintenance dates, as well as procurement dates for SCE&G supplied equipment, end quote. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And is it correct to say that you were clarifying what bases needed to be provided as to the consortium's compliance with the schedule based on what had previously been told to ORS?
I think I understand the context that this was delivered in. So the consortium had said since really end of 13, definitely in a letter format in early 14 in February, that they would be rebaselining the schedule. And we were expecting that to occur in the third quarter of 14. And then by this point in time, we were well over a month into the third quarter of 14. So we were getting a little antsy to get that schedule. We wanted to have that information to look at. And the consortium had been pushing us off and we had been pushing back. So I think we were ready potentially to take the next step and say, if they're not going to give it to us in the proper format, which they were communicating, I think if you go to the last email, we'd been given a preview of what we would get in this presentation or get as far as schedule, which included no electronic file of IPS, the project schedule. We were very disappointed in that. So I think the contract group in business and finance, Ms. Johnson, who was the manager, was looking at, do we need to take the next step in commercial space to try to force the contractor to give us the schedule in the proper format. So, and then just to kind of put more context, I mean, Mr. Torres, who's Alan, that's who I'm referring to in this email, had the position that we were getting enough information to construct the plant if we were going to get the rebaseline schedule when the consortium delivered it. And I think because the consortium wasn't going to give us the full normal items that we had been used to before, that it was just a total game changer. So that's why this discussion occurred.
You would agree, though, that the EPC contract required the consortium to provide a schedule that was more detailed than the 3-week look-ahead and the 18-month look-ahead, correct?
I don't know that it had to be more detailed. I think that they were needed to provide a schedule, and there was understandably a rebaseline that needed to occur after many large moving pieces had changed, including CB&I coming onto the project in 2013 and wanting to rebaseline the schedule. So I think at the beginning there was an understanding that as long as we got a really good, clean final product, that it was understandable that the consortium would want to rebaseline if that was what they were going to hold themselves to for the rest of the project. But at this point in time, they were delivering a partial product or telling us they were going to deliver a partial product, and that was very disappointing.
And it's correct to say that the 3-week look ahead and the 18-month look ahead would not have been a sufficient schedule under the EPC contract for the life of the project, correct?
I don't know. I'm not a contract compliance person.
Okay.
So, I mean, our understanding is we had enough to construct in the near term and that they were going through the rebaseline effort and would give us the schedule that would give us the end dates. And then that would allow us to do things like create a Base Load Review Act milestone schedule, which was needed for regulatory compliance, correct?
So you can't say for sure whether the consortium was in compliance with the Article 3.3 of the EPC contract. Is that fair to say?
Right. I think that was up to Ms. Johnson and her team to decide. She was the contract compliance manager.
Okay. And it's fair to say from this email that she concluded that the consortium was out of compliance, correct?
I think she was stating that her thoughts. I don't know that she had made a conclusion. I think she was looking for affirmation or collaboration from the teammates in NND. That's why she emailed Mr. Smith.
And her thought at this time was that the consortium has not been complying with Article 3.3, correct?
That's right. She says, in my mind, since they have not given us access to a schedule since February 2014, and access to a schedule is not exactly appropriate. I mean, they gave us the near-term schedule. They just had not given us the full deliverable. The consortium had not been complying with Article 3.3. So like I said, it was a gray area. I think that's why the discussion occurred.
And is it correct, Mr. Young, that the EPC contract includes an example of the schedule that the consortium was required to provide to SC&G?
I believe it does in his exhibit. I just can't recall exact.
And in August, you said that you received a schedule from the consortium, the new rebaseline schedule. Is that correct?
We received schedule options from the consortium. We did not receive one schedule.
And is it correct that those schedules had artificial constraints in them that created a problem with respect to the logic of the schedule?
No.
Explain how that's not correct.
Well, the term artificial constraints doesn't create a problem unless you don't manage the constraint. Artificial is just a term that in scheduling speak means the same thing as manual. So artificial, when you have a database and you want to just hit the button and calculate it, a lot of times programmers use that word artificial, and it means the same thing as manual. So you could not just hit the Primavera calculation button and come up with the schedule. You had to understand and manually input information into those specific constraints. So as long as you were doing that, it was a manageable technique to do scheduling.
And isn't it true that sometimes artificial constraints can create a problem where the substantial completion dates turn out to be incorrect on the schedule?
They can if you don't manage them.
Okay. And isn't it true that you found artificial constraints in the consortium schedule that weren't properly managed?
I don't know that they were properly managed. I think we found constraints and we had questions with the consortium about what those constraints were.
And
And they explained them.
I'd like to show you an email dated September 1st, 2014, if I may, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Young, this is an email dated September 1st, 2014, from you to Jonathan Coleman and Bernard Heydrich, copy Ken Brown. And I'll give you a chance to read it, but my question for you, isn't it true that in this email you identified an artificial constraint that was creating a problem with the schedule logic that needed to be removed?
Right. I think we described it as, and I think, again, to give you context, September 1st, so this is less than 2 to 3 weeks into our workshop setting with the consortium. And so we were every day looking at different aspects of the project, and this is the next step in our iteration of our review to understand the schedule, that there was an artificial or manual constraint in the annex building portion of the schedule. And Galen, who was one of the lead schedulers for Mr. Elam's team, was aware, as is required, of the history of the constraint, why it was put in. In fact, that information was stored in their database, who put it in and why. And our thought was we just needed to understand those very closely. We need to review those very closely so we can understand them, and that's just what this is describing.
And you were afraid that these constraints may hide another path or set of activity that needs to be reviewed. Is that correct?
Right. As I described, we were going through a very iterative process. So the consortium had presented a couple of schedule options, and then actually a third schedule option was agreed to be pursued, which is what that reference to the SEP 2018 or September 2018 commercial operation date for Unit 2 and this email is referring to. So we were basically peeling back portions of the schedule, reviewing it, looking at the critical path that was evident from the schedule, understanding that critical path, and then looking at secondary, tertiary, critical paths after that. And this was the next step in the process. Let's look at another portion of the schedule and see if there's another potential path that's very near the actual critical path of the project that we need to be paying more attention to.
And isn't it true that Bechtel, a year later, in its project assessment report, identified these constraints as a concern with respect to the consortium schedule?
They may have. I just don't recall.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that this email be introduced as the next hearing exhibit.
This one, the one before.
Just this email.
This one.
Yes, thank you.
It'll be entered as Exhibit 149.
Now, going further to the schedule, Mr. Young, do you recall that in discovery in this proceeding, you identified the individuals who reviewed the consortium schedule?
I believe that was an ORS AIR request.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
I may, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that this response to an AIR be introduced as the next hearing exhibit.
It will be entered as Hearing Exhibit 150.
Now, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Young, this is a response that you provided to the ORS information request, correct?
Yes.
And the request is to identify by name and title the SC&G construction experts that reviewed the 2015 construction schedule and found the schedule, scope, and sequencing to be logical and appropriate per Stephen Burns' direct testimony. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you identified 7 individuals who had done so. Is that right?
Yes, that's what's in the AIR.
Now, isn't it true that Mr. Heydrich here, he actually called the schedule provided by the consortium to be a joke?
He may have. Mr. Heydrich has a lot of opinions.
And this is an email from Mr. Heydrich to you, copying Jonathan Coleman. And he's referring to the consortium schedule and saying, quote, the schedule is a joke, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct, but the schedule he is describing is not the schedule I've been describing or answering questions from you about for the last few minutes. That's a different schedule product.
What schedule is he talking about?
He is talking about the schedule that was in the email you showed me a minute ago that involved Mr. Smith and Ms. Johnson, where Mr. Elam had described what we'd be getting on August 1st, which included no electronic file of IPS. So what we got and what we were reviewing in the first week to 10 days of August of 2014 was a schedule that was not the actual product we wanted to see. It was not the electronic level 3 schedule that the consortium was managing to. It was a level 2 type product that was insufficient for our review. And then that's when, I think about a week later, right in the middle of August, we set up the workshop to review the actual live schedule with the consortium. So he's referring to just a different product than we eventually reviewed.
And is it your testimony that Mr. Heydrich eventually, as this AIR indicated, that he eventually found the schedule, scope, and sequencing to be logical and appropriate?
Yes. I mean, I think Mr. Heydrich was part of our review. He reviewed the logic in the schedule. He had a lot of concerns, issues. We raised those issues with Mr. Elam. And again, it depends on exactly which schedule or which version of those options the consortium gave us we're talking about, if you're going to pull some information out from during our workshop.
Isn't it true, Mr. Young, that the consortium actually revised its schedule completion dates after August 2014 and before the SCNG filed its petition with this commission in March 2015?
Right. I think what you're trying to explain is that the consortium gave 2 options. The third option was added to review, and that the consortium eventually took the 2 earliest of those options off the table as far as their negotiations.
Actually, I'm referring to something even later. Do you recall in March 2015 that the consortium provided SCNG with an update where it pushed the substantial completion dates back even a little further than the August 2014 options?
No, you'd have to show me something to remind me.
So this is an email from January 2015 regarding a visit by NRC inspectors, and you describe in your testimony visits by NRC inspectors. Is that correct, Mr. Young?
Correct.
And in this email, you're telling Mr. Elam, Mr. Heydrich, that Terry and Aaron are off this week. I would suggest mid to late February for this discussion if they want to walk away with some actual schedule info. And then Mr. Heydrich, in his response to you, he says, quote, "We need to follow up with this soon. We cannot schedule a meeting with the NRC to discuss the schedule if we don't have one," end quote. And it goes on. Is it correct to say that in January 2015, you no longer had a schedule from the consortium, Mr. Young?
So I'm going to give you some context around this email so I think we can all understand it. The NRC employed schedulers in their Atlanta office so that those schedulers could help the inspectors that were at the site and the inspectors that they were sending from Atlanta or some of their other offices off the project to the site. And they used Primavera to do that. They wanted to have the right amount of resources, the right amount of inspectors, and hit the tasks at the right time so they could do their regulatory duties. And this was the first time where we were going to look at meeting with the NRC and giving them access to the electronic Primavera schedule. And just as I described, we had only reviewed the rebaseline schedule in a workshop-like setting. We had not received an official copy of the electronic schedule from that review that went from August, September, October, and then on into January. It was still actually going on. So we weren't just able to hand over the XCR file or the electronic file that you have in Primavera and have a sit-down kickoff meeting with the NRC, which is what this was describing. So that's really what Mr. Bernie Heydrich is describing here. I had assigned him to be the liaison with the NRC and help them get the information they needed.
So that review process that your team was undergoing with the consortium, that started in August, it was still going on all the way through January?
Yes, because negotiations were still going on. The consortium had only presented us schedule options, and so no one had selected the mitigations, and no one had agreed to pay for the mitigations that would tell us which is the most likely schedule out of the three that we had reviewed, because the earlier schedule options required some mitigations to be paid for if they were going to be more realistic.
I'd like to talk about the 2015 amendment, Mr. Young. It's referenced in your testimony. On page 29, you mentioned that Westinghouse and CBI approached SC&G indicating they agreed that the consortium structure was broken and needed to be scrapped. Did the consortium approach you about that?
Sorry, could you repeat the time frame in your question?
Sure. It's shortly after the commission hearing in the 2015 update proceeding concluded, you testified that the consortium approached SC&G about scrapping the consortium structure. Did the consortium actually approach you about that, or someone else?
No, they approached, my understanding is they approached our senior management in about the September timeframe.
So this information is coming to you from others in the company, is that fair to say?
Correct.
Do you know who in the company provided you with this information?
Well, I was told on October 23rd, as I mentioned earlier, that the consortium had chosen to let CB&I exit and Westinghouse was going to take over Stone & Webster, and that our SC&G and Santee Cooper executives, and they had some support team, had been working with the consortium for a number of weeks on that process and on the amendment.
Now, you mentioned in your testimony that SC&G was able to mitigate the cost implications from productivity through the amendment, basically shifting the risk of poor productivity to the consortium. Is that correct?
Correct. By fixing the target portion of the price that had a lot of the labor productivity issue or the labor cost in it, and with that productivity affecting that cost up or down, that risk was shifted to the consortium.
Now, in saying that the risk to SC&G was shift, you're assuming that labor productivity did not play a factor in Westinghouse's bankruptcy, correct?
I don't think I understand your question.
Yeah, let me kind of back it out a little bit. It's fair to say that SC&G and its ratepayers, that this proceeding is now to determine how the allocation of the cost of the project will be allocated, correct?
I think that's part of the hearing, yes, sir.
And so, isn't it true that the cost associated with constructing the project is now being borne by SC&G and its ratepayers, and not by Westinghouse? Is that correct?
I think Westinghouse, as people know, filed for bankruptcy protection.
Right, and I guess what I'm pointing out isn't it correct that your assumption that that SC&G no longer suffered any risk from poor productivity, that's assuming that that's not a reason that drove Westinghouse into bankruptcy, correct?
I mean, I think Westinghouse, that's assuming Westinghouse is going to fulfill their obligations for the contract.
Right, and if poor productivity, which causes higher costs, poor productivity increases the cost of construction, correct?
Typically, yes. Okay,
and so if that was a factor that drove Westinghouse into bankruptcy, then isn't it fair to say that SC&G was not able to shift that risk of poor productivity to Westinghouse?
No, I don't know that you can just say poor productivity was the only factor that sent Westinghouse into bankruptcy. I think my understanding is what sent them into bankruptcy was their parent company was able to, well, first of all, they were unable to support themselves from within their own subsidiary company with profits from other portions of the business, and then that they were unable to get approval for funds or backing or however you want to term it from their parent company, Toshiba.
Isn't it fair to say that the contract became a burden for Westinghouse, to your understanding?
The Vogel contract and the VC Summer contract, yes.
Now, in your 2017 analysis, it's correct that you were part of a team that performed a new analysis to see how much it would cost to complete the project and what the schedule would be to complete the project, correct?
Correct. It was a team that really did a two-part evaluation. First, we received and evaluated or validated or invalidated the Westinghouse assumptions in their estimate to complete. And then once we determined that it wasn't going to be suitable for the owner's needs going forward, we couldn't make some of those same assumptions. Then we were tasked with coming up with what we termed as an owner's ETC.
And the owner's ETC was much later as far as a substantial completion date than the consortium had projected, correct?
The owner's ETC just had vastly different assumptions than Westinghouse. It did not account for a fixed price contract. It did not account for liquidated damages. It did not account for production tax credit deadlines, or not even the deadline, but the influence of incentives, positive or negative, toward those deadlines. It was given at the direction of our senior management to be a schedule that was to be very, very achievable with the lowest cost possible.
And I'm not really interested, or my question doesn't really go to the assumptions, but isn't it true that SC&G determined that the substantial completion dates of the units would be much later than the consortium was projecting?
I think SC&G proposed substantial completion dates that were very different than what Westinghouse had imposed. And that was, you can't just ignore the assumptions. It's because of the assumptions that those dates were proposed.
But you didn't believe that the assumptions used by the consortium were achievable, correct?
There was no fixed price contract.
Is it correct that going forward without Westinghouse, you did not believe that the assumptions that Westinghouse was using to determine their schedule could be met going forward?
Well, I mean, Westinghouse was taking risks for different reasons than the owner would. Westinghouse was trying to construct AP1000s around the world. Westinghouse was trying to write a document one time and use it on 4 active plants and then use it on the next plant they had sold. You know, SC&G wasn't going to do that. SC&G was just going to try to finish these 2 plants with Santee Cooper.
And I understand there's different motivations for the assumptions used by Westinghouse. My question just goes to the actual assumptions. Westinghouse was using much more aggressive assumptions in its schedule than you used in your calculations, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I would object. This question's been asked 3 times, and it's been answered 3 times.
Well, try to answer it one more time, and I understand my concept of time is different than everybody else's in this room, obviously. Yesterday, Mr. Richardson said that we had 1 hour of ORS across for this panel, and we've passed that a long time ago, so it's time to get to it.
This is my last issue, Mr. Chairman. I apologize.
Wonderful.
For the delay. Is it correct to say that, Mr. Young, that the assumptions used by SC&G in its schedule analysis were much less aggressive than the assumptions used by Westinghouse?
They're just very different. Some of the assumptions that SC&G used were more aggressive. Some of the assumptions that Westinghouse used were more aggressive. The dates are different, absolutely, but it's because of hundreds, if not thousands, of assumptions that were made in determining those dates.
And ultimately, those assumptions led SC&G to conclude later substantial completion dates than Westinghouse had determined, correct?
Yes.
And that is also a conclusion that was reached by Bechtel during their assessment, correct?
I don't know that Bechtel reached a conclusion. From what I read a report, they said they needed more probabilistic analysis to determine if that schedule was valid and should be used for any kind of rebaselining of the project.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Young, for your time. I'll move along, Mr. Kokums. I know you've been waiting patiently for a couple weeks.
Oh, you forgot about me.
No, I wouldn't do that. And I know we've been talking about your spreadsheets here, and you deserve an opportunity to comment on your spreadsheets too. I just want to go back to your work on that 2014 EAC team. your team reported to Carlette Walker and Skip Smith. Is that correct?
The 4 of the 5 members reported either to Carlette or Skip. That's correct.
Okay, and Carlette Walker and Skip Smith, they set the overall goals for that team. Is that correct?
That's a fair statement, yes.
And Mr. Brown, he was sort of the team lead for the EAC effort. Is that fair to say?
Well, Mr. Brown was an engineer. The remaining members of the standing team were accountants. And Mr. Brown certainly had much more construction experience than anybody else on the team. From that perspective, he was kind of the leader of the team, yes.
And he was really kind of the go-to guy regarding the productivity factors or performance factors to use in the cost analysis. Is that correct?
That is certainly true. Mr. Brown had a better understanding of how productivity factors work than any other member of the team.
And this team, this EAC team used by SC&G, it was authorized to do its work by senior management, correct?
That is correct. When the consortium delivered us the cost portion of the EAC in August of 2014, we were tasked with understanding the basis of that and coming up with an opinion on the entitlement of those costs.
And in October 2014, your team reported its conclusions to senior management, correct?
I'm sorry, which date did you say?
October 2014.
Yes, so the PowerPoint presentation you showed Mr. Young earlier, yes, we provided an update to management in mid-October of 2014.
Mr. Marsh and Mr. Byrne were present at that presentation, correct?
I recall myself, Ken Brown, and Steve Byrne being there. I'm not sure if Mr. Marsh was there, or there may have been other people there. I just don't recall.
And isn't it true that the EAC team concluded that the consortium's estimate of labor productivity was not achievable?
No, I wouldn't characterize that as our conclusion. What the EAC team really concluded was that if the consortium did not improve, that using a historical productivity factor, the financial implications of that.
And are you familiar with the written report that the team developed?
Yes.
And is it your testimony that the team, that report did not say that the PF estimate used by the consortium was not achievable?
Well, I think what the written report said is that assuming that the consortium doesn't make any changes, the financial implications of them not making changes would be, and it gave a dollar amount. I don't remember the amount off the top of my head.
Is it true that before the October 2015 amendment, SC&G was required to pay 90% of disputed costs related to labor productivity?
So there were 2 portions of the EPC contract that allowed us to, I guess you could use the word dispute. If the cost was invoiced properly, we had to pay the 90%. If we deemed that the cost was not invoiced properly, we didn't pay any of it.
But if it was invoiced properly, even if the cost was disputed, the company would have to pay 90% and then dispute whether it could recover that money later, right?
So for the productivity factor, that is a true statement. We made the determination then that we would pay 10% of those costs and dispute the remaining 90%.
So the payment up front was 10% or 90%?
I'm sorry, the payment was 90%, and we disputed the full amount. We actually disputed the whole amount.
Right.
Yeah, so we withheld 10%. I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, in February 2015, you worked with Carlette Walker and Marion Cherry. With Marion Cherry and Ken Brown on a analysis of cost using a 1.55 productivity factor. Is that correct?
Over the course of the 10 plus years, I worked a lot with Mr. Brown and Mr. Cherry. I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
Let me go ahead and show you one of the spreadsheets. It's Exhibit 32 to Ms. Walker's deposition, which is Exhibit 12, if I may, Mr. Chairman. So there's three sets of initials at the top of this sheet, Mr. Kokums. It's KJB, WMC, and KRK. That last set of initials, KRK, those are your initials, right?
That's correct.
And this is a spreadsheet that you prepared or worked on with Mr. Brown and Mr. Cherry around February 2015?
That's correct. I would kind of describe this as a sensitivity analysis where you plug in different factors and it calculates the financial implications of those factors.
And is it true that in this analysis you went ahead and accepted the budgeted direct man hours required to complete the project that were budgeted in the EPC contract?
I would assume so for this particular version of it. I would assume that just the factors highlighted in yellow were the inputs that we changed.
Is it correct that in the work you did with the 2014 EAC team, your team didn't scrutinize the consortium's estimate of the number of hours left to complete the work? It simply determined how productive the estimate would be to complete that work. Is that correct?
I don't specifically recall whether we dug in. I imagine we did dig into those basis hours, those direct hours. I just don't recall exactly what we did. That would have been probably something Mr. Brown would have done.
Okay. And in this analysis, you used a productivity factor of 1.55. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that's higher than the number 1.4 that you used in the October 2014 presentation. Is that right?
Again, this is a sensitivity analysis. I would imagine we probably put in different numbers and ran this thing 100 different times just to see what the impact would be of those ratios and those productivity factors changing.
But in this sheet right here, you used a 1.55 factor, which is a worse productivity factor than the 1.40 that you presented to senior management in October 2014, correct?
That is correct. For this particular one, we used a 1.55 productivity factor.
And you did that because productivity was worsening over the life of the project, correct?
To be honest with you, I don't know why we put a 1.55 in this particular one.
Is it correct that the performance factor on the project got worse throughout the life of the project?
I didn't really track productivity factor. That wasn't something I was responsible for, so I don't really have good insight into what it was. I would imagine it did go up. I just am speculating there.
And by go up, you mean get worse?
Correct. But again, I'm speculating there. I didn't have responsibility to track the productivity factor.
I'd like to show you a discovery response provided by SC&G in the state court action, the class actions in state court that's occurring currently. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask that this discovery response by SC&G be entered as the next hearing exhibit.
Be entered as exhibit number 151.
Now, Mr. Kokums, if you could turn to page 8 of this document. At the bottom of page 8, number 5, the question presented is set forth the historical performance factors for the VC Summer project from 2008 through abandonment. And then it goes on to ask for some of the background of where that information came from. And then on page 9 and 10, the document goes on to to list cumulative PFs from November 2010 through November 2016. Do you see that?
Yes, yeah, I see that.
And the first, basically 2 years of the project, the PF, after the first few months, let's start around April 2011, it's 1.18. Then it drops to 0.98 in May 2011. Then if you follow down to June 2012, it creeps back above 1.0. Is that correct?
That's what this says, yes.
And now, is it true that the first nuclear construction on the project didn't start till 2013? Is that correct to say?
I don't know that I can answer that question. I know nuclear construction has a pretty specific meaning. I don't know that I'm qualified to
I should probably ask that of Mr. Young. Mr. Young, do you know when nuclear construction, was it March 2013 that began?
March 2013 was the Nuclear Island base map pour. The nuclear construction, safety-related construction had started many months before that, once we got the license in 2012.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Young. So, Mr. Kokums, does this chart show that the productivity, the cumulative PF, steadily increased from 2012 up through November 2016?
Yes, that's what this shows.
And the cumulative PF that's not the PF for the month. That's adding in each monthly PF to the historical PF. Is that correct?
That's what I would assume. I didn't produce this, so I would assume that's correct, yes.
Okay. And so in October 2014 on this chart, the cumulative PF was 1.49, and then in January 15 it had increased to 1.55. Is that right?
That's what it says, yes.
So if that number is true, then looking at this spreadsheet, the PF used of 1.15, that would be using the historical productivity on the project to date. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And on this chart, you use that PF to calculate the actual man hours that would be needed to complete the project. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what this model does is take the direct hours that need to be achieved and ratios it with a productivity factor. That's correct.
And you also have several other factors regarding the FNM ratio and the direct to indirect ratio, correct?
That's correct.
And now if you look at the line called months remaining in project, do you see where that line item on the schedule is?
The 52?
Correct. Now, is it fair to say on that line that what you're doing there is you're doing an independent addition to the project cost where you multiply the number of months left to complete the project by a certain defined cost per month?
Again, it's been a while since I've seen this, but what I think that does is it's trying to come up with an estimate of the non-labor costs. So specifically, there's a target expenses cost, and we assumed $2.5 million per month, and we just needed to know how many more months that $2.5 million would be incurred.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to take about a 10-minute break, so I hope with ORS y'all can sort of talk it over and figure out how to finish your hour.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.